As you can tell, we've kind of been circling around some of these main themes when we're talking about issues of the WUI, and that has to do with working with communities, insurance, and also how do we fund this work, how do we get support for this work, and so that's kind of what is the basis for these next 3 building block sessions. So I'm going to welcome up Kat Edgeley. She's a social science researcher at Northern Arizona University to kick us off talking about fire-adapted communities.
Good afternoon. Good to see everyone here after lunch. Hopefully I'm not going to send you to sleep. I'm going to talk a little bit this afternoon for the next half an hour about fire-adapted communities. So I'm a wildfire social scientist. I look at how communities adapt to fire before, during, and after, and all of the different variations that can entail for different communities, and they are really, really different in Arizona, so we have a lot to talk about. And what I'm hoping to do is kind of set a little bit of a baseline for this conversation, hoping that you'll take away some ideas on how to define community when you talk about it in this context, how to think about community as a process rather than something stagnant, and then ways to kind of collectively in this room think about how we can help communities moving forward. So I want to go back to basics to start with, and when we're talking about the ecological side of fire, a lot of the times we're thinking about how do we build up to the landscape scale. We want to get landscape scale resilience going through prescribed fire, mastication, all of those different things. But the challenge is there's a lot of communities within the landscape, however you want to define landscape, and those communities can be really, really different. So if we think about stuff like forest management, an even age stand, we're going to manage that really differently from somewhere with a very varied fire mosaic, mixed vegetation. It's the same with communities. They're all at different places in that kind of process of thinking about fire. And the social science around this topic, there's a lot of social science out there about communities and fire. It all points to community as the scale or the right level to have these conversations about human adaptation to fire. So that is understanding all the variation at the household level and all the variation in communities at the landscape scale, convening in that middle point because people already act at that community level. So I mentioned there's a lot of social science out there. In the Southwest, there's more than 40 years of social science research that's been published. And interestingly, the earliest paper I can find is from 1982 in Tucson. A group of folks did a phone survey of residents in Tucson back in like 1980. And even back then, they were asking about support for prescribed fire. I think, if I remember correctly, more than 80% of respondents, and there were several thousand respondents, were in support of prescribed fire. So we've had a lot of support in Arizona for more than 4 decades now, and it's often a vocal minority that we're working with that can bring challenges in that space. So acceptance for fire management activities is much higher than we often think about. So community is the right scale. We're now hearing this language about fire-adapted communities. We've been hearing it for actually quite a long time now. It started to emerge like in the 2000s and became kind of integrated into policy ideas a little after that. So the big place we really saw it introduced, I think, is the cohesive management strategy back 10 years ago or so. That one of the 3 pillars of the cohesive management strategy is fire-adapted communities. We've got great organizations now, like the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, who are doing incredible work to help communities move along in that process. And we're seeing ideas about human communities integrated into some of these really big projects, things like the Wildfire Crisis Strategy landscape stuff through USDA. So we're having this conversation about fire-adapted communities and what that entails. Before we talk about what a fire-adapted community is, though, we need to talk about the community in fire-adapted communities and what that means. So hopefully I'm not going too far back to basics, but we have a lot of different ideas about how to define community in this space, whether it's wildland urban interface community, whether it's community on a map. So maybe we'll start there. The most common definition we're talking about when we say community is somewhere that you can see boundaries of on a map. That's what policy tends to lean towards, but within a mapped area, things can be really, really different. So just within Tucson, you've probably got pockets of very different people, same in Flagstaff, Prescott. When we say something of that scale as a community, we have to understand all the variation within that as well. So the second kind of definition of community is a type of relationship. We all have that in this room. We're all here because we care about fire in some way, shape, or form. This doesn't have to be geographic. It can be a working group. It can be a homeowners association where half the people live in another state and they come here every now and then. So that connection between people and what matters to them. Then we've got a local social system, and this is getting a little bit more complex. It's people in a place and the way they interact together in that location. But we can take it one step further, and this is getting a little social science heavy, but interactional fields of community. And this is this idea that people inform place and place informs people, and they're evolving. So community is not just a stagnant thing, it's a process that's always changing. You go to a community in 2000, then you come back in 2010, probably a lot's changed. That community identity has evolved. That can look like many different things. That could be an aging population. It could be loads of people from California moving to Prescott. It could be a bedroom community evolution from the outside of a city. It could be people with loads of fire experience getting together and having conversations. So we've got the people changing, the building patterns, many other things like that. But then we've also got this ecological relationship with a place too. So what happens when a fire burns through? How does that change the community? Who's leaving? Who's staying? What are they going to do about fire in the future? And we've already talked today about a few really big anchor fires or kind of benchmark fires that tell this story really well. The Rodeo Cheddar Sky for Flagstaff, it's a Schultz fire that everyone points back to, and that becomes the benchmark for every other fire. It defines how they talk about adaptation there. In Tucson, I think it's still the Aspen fire, although Bighorn fire comes up a lot as well. So we've got this kind of repeated circulation or reinforming of people and place together in an interactional community. Oh, and maybe I'll just show you an example from Flagstaff. So this is the Flagstaff area. Bottom circle is Kachina Village. That is a very distinct community. They have pretty similar ideas. Right above it, Forest Highlands, very wealthy HOA, very different kind of folks. This is Mountain Air. People say it used to be just like Kachina Village, but then they kind of drifted apart. On the back end of Mountain Air, there's some very different styles of lots and people. They've got horses. The houses up front are much smaller lots, tend to be families, whereas the back is more retirees. We come up Old Buns. That's kind of a collection of interesting houses that are just on the city limits. Then we've got all these kind of university-related communities, places in downtown Flagstaff. If we just said Flagstaff as a community, we'd be talking geographic, but when we come down to the scale, these are interactions of people who care about the same thing in the same place, and they're informed by these relationships. So it goes without saying, one-size-fits-all ideas about talking about community really doesn't work for fire. It doesn't work for a lot of things, but especially not fire. Okay, so that brings me to, what is a fire adapted community? Me and a colleague a few years ago were thinking about, well, what is the definition of this? So we decided to do a little search of all the papers out there published by scientists about fire adapted communities. And it turns out everyone uses it in the title or says that it's a goal. No one defines what it is, or it's really hard to define. But we looked across how people were using it, and we saw a few key factors or similarities in the way that people talked about these things. The first is it's a relationship between a group of assorted people working together towards the same goal. So that could be residents, professionals, politicians, emergency managers, you name it. They're all collaborating and they're planning, but they're also taking action. So it's not just getting together and talking, it's doing something about it afterwards. That's a really key difference. So we're moving towards some kind of action and thinking about it iteratively, just like that idea of an interactional community. The other relationship in this is with fire, allowing fire to occur in an area with minimal impact to human well-being, social functioning, things like that, while reducing the need for us to actively suppress stuff all the time. And then the last piece of this is that local ecological knowledge, acknowledging the need for fire in that place as well. So these were some commonalities, and I think there's different shades. I don't want to prescribe one definition of fire adapted community, but these are commonalities in their definition. But then we saw people use this term in two very different ways of conceptualization. So I want to spend a little bit of time on these two. There's a policy-based idea of what a fire adapted community is, and then there's a process-based. So we'll dive in a bit deeper in a minute, but the policy-based side is when you see fire adapted communities used in something like a report or in a piece of policy saying our goal is to support fire adapted communities, or to create them, or to give them resources to do that thing. It's a goal, objective, a target. They tend to be pretty high level, and we see this a lot in national policy. But it often describes an umbrella term for a lot of different activities that might fit under this term. So that could be Firewise, that could be CWPPs, that could be grants for fire departments. It could be many things. And the cohesive strategy is a great example of this. One of the biggest challenges that happens in this space of policy-defined fire adapted communities is we call it a goal in search of a process. We know the end goal or the direction we want to go in is fire adaptation, but how do we get there? And it's not as simple as saying a Firewise community, what are all the steps to create it and maintain it? Or it's not as simple as saying we need to increase home ignition zone uptake. It's what do we need to communicate? What's the messaging behind that? So that leads us to this process-based idea. And this is kind of a much broader idea of what a fire adapted community is. It's no specific end goal. It's a never-ending quest, which is not fun to communicate to a community, but it's the truth that there is no end goal. You have to keep going, and it's not going to be linear. And the other unique thing about this definition is it's about the evolution of a place. So I talked about interactional communities, that people are changing and places changing all the time. We can recognize that and incorporate it and start working bottom up from a community. It's good to work top down sometimes, but we also need to see what's on the ground and build up. And because of that, this methodology or this approach is much more interested in emergent findings. So we get together and we talk about something. Well, what did we talk about? How did we get to that point? Or we do this activity. Well, what else emerged out of that? What's the next step? It kind of isn't necessarily prescriptive, although there are activities that can help. And this is not to knock policy-based definitions. Everything starts from a policy-based definition in this space. But how can we get that policy-based definition beyond it? How does it go from a piece of paper to people on the ground doing this work? And at a lot of conferences, you hear people talk about fire cultures. Well, how do we adopt or integrate community values with the need for fire on the ground? So the policy-based definition is probably what we see most commonly. This is really well designed for geographic definitions of community. When you think about CWPPs and you're talking about at the county level or maybe a municipality level, often it's really clear geographically where we're talking about. But an underlying piece of this is that it can imply not much else is moving, that it's the social piece that's hard. But the ecology is changing all the time. So how do we build a little bit more of that flexibility into those conversations? And they either have a singular definition of adapted, or they're not giving a definition. And there's pros and cons to both. But we know that adaptation looks really different for different communities, so it's hard to prescribe that. The real risk in this space is that we start to develop checklists, and it feels like when we do everything, we're done. Or if we just do all of these activities, well, we've run out of things, so we must be fire adapted. When realistically, it is that process. It's the changes over time. It's the ebbs and flows of a place as things move. So this process-based idea is really more interactional. How do people come together around these conversations in the policy to make them happen and then go beyond them to tell a bigger story? And because of that, there's not really a singular piece of policy that's going to help us create a fire adapted community. And in some places, policy might not even be a part of that. If you think about probably some of your more challenging communities in rural places that maybe don't hang together or connect, they don't have a homeowners association, maybe policy is not going to be the big driver there. That means we also need not only the formal approaches that policies recommend, but also these informal things. We all know communities where you drive down a dirt road in the middle and everyone calls each other and goes, have you seen this car? Well, that's a great mechanism for a phone tree for evacuation, but we're not writing that bunch of gossipy people in a community as a kind of fire adaptation, but it can be. So lots of moving pieces, or a recognition of a broader spectrum perhaps in this space. And I also want to acknowledge that's not a linear process. It goes up and down. We talk about like forest succession. There's different kinds of plants. The same in the landscape, different kinds of communities doing different things and growing in different directions. If you get a fire, that might be a setback, or it might open the doors to a whole new suite of adaptation activities. So definitely not linear. And there are some really great resources and ideas about what the suite of activities that starts the policy into the process-based definition, what that can look like. So I want to get us thinking a little bit more. Okay, if we've got these process-based fire adapted communities, how do we start to figure out what they want if they're all so different and they're at different points in their adaptation journeys? And this is a handy little diagram. We affectionately call it the flower model. And this is a conversation about the elements that build a fire adapted community, or allow them to have the adaptive capacity to change their future or to reflect on where they've been. So at the top, we've got demographic and structural characteristics, and this is kind of the classic who lives there on paper, what are the development patterns there, things like that. Classic things that go into vulnerability modeling, for example. But we probably all know someone who's 85 and will drive a tractor around in the middle of a fire doing who knows what, but doing a good job of it. And we all probably know someone under 30 who has never used a shovel. So it's not as simple as if you're old, you're vulnerable, or if you're young, you're not. And that's why all these other pieces are really helpful. Things like place-based knowledge. Have they experienced fire before? What was that experience like? Did they evacuate or stay and defend? And what did that teach them about fire in the landscape? And how will they use that moving forward? I'm covering up at the bottom. I believe it's relationships, people, and place. So who talks with who? Do people even talk to each other, or do they like to be left alone? Do they like the Forest Service, or do they like the agencies they're interacting with? What's the history of that? That affects how they access and use collaboration in different ways. And then the last piece I'll draw your attention to is this scientific and technical knowledge. Do they have access to it? And if they do they know how to use it? Maybe you've got a community who's got someone who retired from BP and is a great grant writer, but they're not necessarily a fire ecologist, or they don't know about fire ecology, versus a community who's very low income, but they all know how to run chainsaws. So they're going to be out there doing work on the ground. Those are two very different ideas of adaptation that this can help us kind of tease out. And it's more complicated than this. There's like 21 different characteristics under each of these, but this is the high-level version. So you can imagine that every community has a different combination of these things. And when we start to read around these characteristics, we can see commonalities across different communities in where they're going and what makes them tick. And that can help us align our ability to support with resources, with conversations, with partnership into who they are as a community and what they value. So I want to show you a few quick examples here. One is from Parks, Arizona. This is 25 miles west of Flagstaff. We went out there originally, we did a survey, we did some interviews, and we were asking about smoke adaptation in rural areas. What makes them interested in adapting to smoke, if anything, which, spoiler, they were not super interested in it. But we asked them about a few different things. One was clean air spaces, and questions came up, well, can I bring my livestock there? Is there Wi-Fi there? Because otherwise I don't want to go. We also talked about evacuation and who could fund that. Well, if the government's funding it, they're not going to take it. So that's a different conversation. So actually what we really gravitated around was HEPA filters, air purifier programs, because it allowed them to keep that independent streak that that community is really proud of. They also didn't trust a lot of different government entities. So the local fire department was the right home for this program. We then talked a little bit about, well, okay, if we started a HEPA filter program, how would it operate? Could it be donation-based? Would it be like library books where you check it out? Would it be a cost share situation? And out here, they want donations. They're not going to invest in something like this themselves. But then it opened a door to, well, don't give it to Bob down the road because it'll be on Facebook Marketplace next week. And don't give it to this second homeowner because they have a house somewhere else. So that tells us we need to be really transparent when we help communities build these programs about who gets priority. And for additional context, we did do this in another community with more second homeowners, and there was a lot more interest in cost shares there. So that can just kind of speak to the differences between these communities. Another example I want to show you is from Flagstaff. When the museum fire happened in 2019, we surveyed households about their experiences with that fire afterwards. And I wanted to pull out two things from the survey about the Ready, Set, Go system. So this is an evacuation system, 3-tier, that helps people decide when they're at a risk level they don't want to be at anymore and they can evacuate. We'd originally surveyed people on city limits, in the evacuation areas for this fire, and then the post-fire flood risk area to see if there were differences. This is the first question I want to draw your attention to. We asked them, do people expect to be notified in person by professionals about when to evacuate? And you can see across the board on this far right column, 72 to 75% expect someone to show up at their door. So this tells us this community actually has a really big, maybe too much trust in the government. And that relationship is going to be really different when we help them adapt. This is kind of interesting. I just wanted to slip it in as well. For people who use the Ready, Set, Go system to evacuate, they were less likely to say it was clear than someone who'd never used it before. So once you've gone through the system, you had more questions than answers. That tells us that some of these national level programs need to have nuance added to them at the local level to answer questions that they might have. And then the last one I'll pull out here is about timber sale to the west of Flagstaff as well. In this area, there's a huge amount of support for forest management and fire. There was no question about the timber sale happening. They were fed up of being told fire is good. They already know that. Now they want to know about how you decided the prescription, how you decided where it was going to be, when you're going to burn piles and why. So it's also about the level of information that we share with communities that help them move along that adaptation trajectory as well. So we've been doing this in Arizona through the Arizona Wildfire Initiative in a few key places. We're starting to work with key informants in communities where we're interested in what the next step on the scale of fire adaptation is. So we're doing these key informant interviews, community consultations, which is basically meeting with as many people from different corners of the community as possible, and then helping co-produce next steps in some way. And ideally, that would be a reinforcing circle over time. We've done this in a few places. Patagonia, we're working with, Pinetop Lakeside, and we're just getting started in Oak Creek Canyon as well. And what I want to do to kind of close out here is share a few overarching findings that are coming out of these 3 cases and many other cases across Arizona in the last 5 years. And these are kind of food for thought for us on how we can help communities move along this spectrum. The first is this idea of value stacking. Not everywhere is that interested in fire. So how do we nest it in something they care about already? In Patagonia, there's a big mine being introduced down there. Everyone's extremely concerned about that. How do we get a conversation about watershed health and fire in there? Or if there's increased vehicle use and new roads, how do we talk with the mine about extending that road into a fuel break in the community? How can we stack those things together in ways that align with what the community cares about? I don't want to go too much into insurance, but a lot of places are getting dropped. I think we're going to hear more about that later today or this week. But now people are starting to say, well, what can I do to prevent my insurance company from dropping me? And we've got a great space there to ask questions about what people are willing to do versus what insurance companies are willing to cover. There's also some space to start tessellating grants together. So we've got Joint Chiefs, Wildfire Crisis Strategy Landscapes. We've got smaller grants. They're all working in the same direction. Let's have a conversation about how we extend fuel breaks across those, or how we get the conversation going between communities in those landscapes so that we can start to level back up to the landscape sales socially as well. How do we go beyond funding is another question. So it's really exciting to hear all this funding become available for communities. How do we make sure they're not dependent on it long term? Because that's not a sustainable system either. So is that when we ask them to write grants for us, that there's also a section where they say how they'll maintain the work that funded for the next 10 years? Is it kind of thinking long term like that? And then I also want to draw attention to prioritizing risk reduction efforts with equity in mind. Often we're talking about first come, first served programs just to get things going. Is that the best way to manage risk on a landscape when there's many, many parcels with different socio-demographic situations or with different levels of risk? The other question around funding is how we create structures for funding that are more equitable than what we have now. It's really easy to fund a community who's a HOA, who's really organized. What about those more rural communities or more disparate communities where they don't get together that much? Just because they don't organize all the time in ways that we expect them to doesn't make them less deserving of funding. So how do we build out mechanisms if we're going in that direction that support them? Is it equipment libraries? Is it funding some kind of skill-based workshop? Can we be more diverse about the things we fund? Then we can also talk about acknowledging and addressing preconceived notions of fire risk, and I think Neil did a great job of this earlier with the photos of the kind of public lands next to private lands. There's a lot of conversation about stuff coming off the forest or off public lands into private lands. Let's think about the other way around a little bit more and kind of put some pre-existing ideas of risk aside. And then the last thing I'll say is we have a really cool opportunity in Arizona. We've got a lot of unknowns about ecosystem adaptation to fire here. Those can be great catalysts. Let's get experts together in front of the public and talk about what we do and don't know. Let's see if we have landowners willing to experiment on things with us. These question marks are great opportunities to bridge the gaps between different players. So I'll return to this and say that hopefully in this conversation today, you're taking away an opportunity to think a little bit more about how to integrate that community understanding into a landscape and scale it up. And then that this is an invitation to think about the histories of the communities you work in, work with, are a part of, where they've been, where they're going, what makes them tick, and how you can integrate these into these more structured ideas of what a fire-adapted community is that maybe we're being required to do in our jobs or in policy. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. I think we have 5 minutes for questions, maybe.
I was just hoping you might talk a little more about what are the commonalities that you found across those three different areas that you've been working so far and some of the results of what you've done there?
That's a good question. I'll pull out one commonality immediately, which is a relationship between tourism and fire resilience. So there's a lot of concern about external visitors to communities bringing in new risk, which is its own kind of preconceived notion. But we've been able to, and Megan's been the leader on a lot of this, work with chambers of commerce on developing business continuity planning, develop long-term rental packet or short-term rental packets that go in Airbnbs to kind of move things along a step. And in all of these communities, or most of them, tourism is a big driver of the economy. Fire comes through, that tax base is gone. So it's thinking outside the box a little bit about what a fire-adapted community might be. It's not just households, it's also businesses, it's also agencies, it's the connection between all of those things. So I'll pull that out as one example and say there's many, many more, but that's the one we're making the most progress on, thanks to Megan.
I'm curious if there's a particular format when you're trying to get this message out to communities that you see more successful than others. I realize demographics will play into that and all, but I'm just kind of curious overall. You see public speaking or flyers or social media, what
Yep.
seems to be best?
Yes, you won't be surprised to hear that it depends. But I'd say what's really effective in the places that are not interested in moving in the direction right now is a show rather than a tell. So that community I pulled the smoke example from, there's a lot of questions about whether HEPA filters work. They're questioning science. That's kind of a theme right now in the US. So people really didn't know if they wanted HEPA filters in their house because they didn't know how it worked. So we talked about the hub in that community is a Texaco. Let's put an air purifier in there when it's a low smoke day so everyone can come in and see it working in action. And then there's information on top of that filter about where you can buy one or DIY box fan version. That's a great example. When you start a big fuels treatment project, doing a really visible area in a community first to get buy-in is not a clear cut. It looks like this. It's great for wildlife, building out from there. So I think all the traditional ways, social media, public meetings work, but it's increasingly important that we demonstrate, we put evidence behind our words, especially in the more rural pockets of Arizona right now.
You were discussing a little bit about Airbnbs and giving information to people who are coming from larger communities into, around Flagstaff and central Arizona for enjoying the weather in the summer. But I also am going to ask you about distributed camping. And I live in an area in central Arizona north of Payson, and we live on a dirt road, and there's lots and lots of people who come up in the summertime and basically all through the year to camp.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they're not paying attention to or don't read the signs about whether or not they can have a fire. And I want to know if there's any successful strategies in your area to deal with this.
This is a good question. We've just been working on this in Flagstaff recently, and we held some focus groups with different groups of the public talking about similar challenges to this. The first thing people were talking about is where are these people coming from? Because can we start the campaigns back there? If they're coming from Phoenix, how do we work with Discover Phoenix or the Visitors Center to start the messaging there? Because once they're on the road, we know they're probably not going to change their behavior regardless of what information they get. They're already committed to it. So that's one space that I think works well. The other thing would be additional patrols, but we know that agencies are really limited in their capacity right now. So the last thing that really stood out to us is a keen interest from the public in knowing how to report this kind of stuff. And there are hotlines, things like that, making that information more available so that we can get more reporting in on abandoned campfires, things like that, that then hopefully feed back for prevention staff to then be able to advocate for more resources in their district. So no clear solution, but multiple pathways to move forward, I think. Great question. Okay, thank you very much.